Hello. We'll just give a few moments for people to join us. We're pleased to welcome back all who are able to join with us today. This is our 7th discussion in our series called The Pandemic of Racism. Senator Kuchar and I have been hosting these sessions as an opportunity to create what we call braver spaces for conversations about the difficult topic of racism. And we hope that it inspires people to action.
Right. And I'm sort of sad that today is the last day, but we've got some wonderful panelists to be able to join us. And I get the chance to introduce the first of them. Real pleasure to introduce a colleague, previous colleague. He always will be a colleague, Senator Grant Mitchell. He was elected to the Alberta legislature in the 1980s, was leader of the Alberta Liberal Party, and was appointed to the Senate of Canada in March 2005, representing the province of Alberta. And he worked as government liaison in the Senate until he retired in 2020. During his time there, he worked to support same-sex marriage, transgender rights, issues related to harassment of the RCMP, and climate change. And he is now luckily and happily retired, riding his bike frequently in the hills around Vernon, BC, and continuing to work on good things. Well, welcome, Grant.
Thanks very much, Senator Kuchar.
Welcome.
Great to be here.
And also with us today is Dr. Nancy Ross. Dr. Ross is an assistant professor at Dalhousie University School of Social Work, and she completed her PhD in peace studies at Bradford University in the UK. Prior to academia, she worked as a clinical therapist in the mental health and addictions field and in community development. Her current research topics include gendered violence, adverse childhood experiences and resilience, trauma responsive systems, mindfulness, cross-cultural diversity research, and identity of social work. I'm pleased to call her a friend, a colleague, and an ally. Mm-hmm. And our first question today, and we'll ask you to start off, Nancy. Our first question is, what does allyship mean to you?
So allyship to me is it's making a choice, commitment to critiquing our current world order and imagining a new one, and taking steps to address structural inequity and cultural violence. So for me, it has been an emotional and intellectual commitment. So when I say emotional, I'm thinking of the concept of critical allyship, which builds upon the work of Anne Bishop and the Anti-Oppressive Network that defines allyship as an active, consistent, and arduous practice of unlearning and reevaluating in which a person of privilege seeks to operate in solidarity with marginalized groups of people. So why might this be arduous? So I think the Truth and Reconciliation Commission highlighted this for us. And it's difficult to look at painful truths. And I'm thinking of 3 examples that highlight why this is at times an emotional process. And one involves a student of mine who wrote a paper, a young person who wrote a paper describing their experiences of racism in Nova Scotia throughout their journey in the school system. And throughout that, and then after describing in pretty devastating terms that experience, and noting many friends who hadn't been able to finish high school or graduate in a way that they could go to university, they said that not in my generation, not in my children's generation, but maybe in my grandchildren's generation, change will happen. And when I read this, I was thinking, oh, it can't be that bad. It can't take that long. And I mentioned this to a colleague of mine, and they said, you should sit with this. You should think about this. And I did. And for me, that was emotional because this is in my own province of Nova Scotia, and this was in 2019. So, you know, it wasn't in 1930 or 40 or 50 or, you know, it was 2019. So for me, it's emotional to think about the harms that are perpetuated in an ongoing way still today. So that's one example. And then I think about the words of Marie Baptiste. She writes about othering and difference as resulting from colonialism as inflicting a soul wound on Indigenous people, on the land, and on diverse groups and minorities. And then I just want to conclude with this one last example was I heard AJ Parsaram, he's an instructor at Dalhousie University. He spoke at a panel called Interrogating Whiteness. And he referred to whiteness as a pathological condition of society today that has emerged from the dehumanization of humanity. So thinking about those, you know, those examples for me has stirred up some emotion. So I think becoming an ally is a commitment to be uncomfortable. I mean, to be comfortable with discomfort. And then intellectually, I don't want to go on too far, but intellectually, it means to really think about systems and the way that systems perpetuate systemic, cultural, and structural inequities.
Thank you, Nancy. You touched on a number of themes that I'm hoping we get a chance to come back to, but I'm going to invite Grant to respond to that question now. And Grant, I'm so happy that we were able to entice you out of retirement to join us today.
Well, as I said, Wanda, you just can't say no to Senator Thomas Bernard. So I'm very pleased to be here, though, and I'm very pleased that you would have asked me to. Very powerful presentation by Nancy, and I think parallel, maybe not as eloquently, but some things that she's saying. For me, the first time I really heard about allyship was when Senator Thomas Bernard invited me to speak, asked me to speak on her inquiry in the Senate on anti-Black racism, and I hadn't really ever given that kind of thought that I should have. I thought I had, but I hadn't. So I came, and allyship was a feature of that. And I concluded a couple things. First of all, two premises. One is that it starts with an understanding that racism is very real. It's insidious. It creates horror and disadvantage and corrosion in people's lives. And a second assumption is that somebody like me has to be very, very careful about imagining for 1 second that I can appreciate what that is, what that means, because it really dawned on me while working on that inquiry that I have never been discriminated against in my entire life. And what are the elements of what discrimination brings to a person's life? But then once you recognize that, then you're driven. You have to do something about it, it seems to me. And there's two features of that. One is what I've come to conclude is institutional. That's speaking in the Senate about an inquiry. It's working on rights at that level. It's teaching at a university. It's managing or owning a business where you have rules and laws and policies. And that's important, obviously extremely important. But a second feature of allyship, which really struck me, and which is what I'm wrestling with now as a person who doesn't have those fora to deal with, and I should always be wrestling with this, is at an individual relationship level. How do I relate to the person who's working in the store that I'm buying something from, or a colleague, or a neighbor, or somebody I meet in the gym, and that's really driven me, because I feel that if you reduce this to, not reduce it, but focus on allyship at an individual level, then you bring out the humanity of it. And once you begin to consider, this is a human being with feelings and family and hopes and aspirations, all of which can be jeopardized by discrimination. Empathy is just a hop, skip, and a jump away from that. And then you can begin to relate to people one person at a time, I think is what it comes down to. And that's a very powerful force to me, because that's ultimately where it has to be fixed. The problem with that I also wrestle with is it's very easy to be patronizing or condescending in that regard because aren't I great? Here I am trying to recognize you, and Senator Thomas Bernard and I talked about that recently, and I think it relates to the second question that you've got on the agenda, so I'll leave it to that. But for me, it's one-on-one, and I've had a number of experiences where I've talked to recently to a person who was working in a store, came back 5 months later, remembered her.
You're in the frame again.
Remembered her, and we had a long talk about the fact that she was a student and what she was doing with social work and mental health, and ultimately I felt it was appropriate for me to ask her if she'd ever thought about going into politics. And Senator Thomas Bernard referred to that as planting a seed. Maybe there's something, I think there is something to that. Yeah.
Sure.
Well, one of the things that strikes me, and I certainly both of you have touched on so many essential components of this, is that this allyship that we're talking about is a process, and it has to be both active and it has to be sustained. So going on a march, virtue signaling is not allyship. It's not, look at me, how wonderful I am. It's got to be, and it can be, as Grant, as you said it, at the individual level, and as Dr. Ross has said it, at the institutional and structural level. All of us have many different roles and many different places where we touch people. And it's making sure that we continue touching in an active and sustained way. I think that those are all key components of this.
I agree.
Absolutely. And I think that really touches on really the difference between performative allyship and authentic allyship, or as Nancy talked about, critical allyship. And I've seen and experienced far too much performative allyship in my lifetime. And performative allyship is really when someone is doing it because it makes them look better. It makes them feel good. It's in the moment. You feel like you want to do something. So how can we help people move beyond? Because for some people, that performative piece may be the first step. How do you get people beyond the first step of allyship to the deeper, I think one of the words you used was commitment. So the deeper commitment. The relationship was another word that you've used in this discussion so far. So how do you get people beyond that initial, okay, I need to do something, so I'll join the march, to how do you sustain it? How do you get that commitment? Would either of you like to comment on that, please?
Nancy, I can. I mean, I could start. You started last time. I emphasize again the point that it is that bringing people to consider this at the individual level, relationship level, is very powerful to me, because that's where it's not removed. It is that person who you see in the gym, on the bus, in the coffee shop, who you would normally probably take up a conversation with, but you don't always, and so they're not recognized in the way that they might be, and that's just another feature of exclusion. Part of convincing people to get to that is, I think, and Dr. Ross, you talked about this, the systemic racism. It's very easy to dismiss that and to not appreciate that. And as I've thought about it more and more, I mean, it's so obvious when you see now, especially it's everywhere, that we see it, maybe unfortunately or fortunately, in a perverse way, raised by the era, the last 4 years in the States to some extent. But I think that's very important. I think it's important to address with people the reality of this. And one example that I talked about with Senator Barack Thomas a while ago was a friend of mine who's my age, late 60s, and started with humble beginnings, and was kind of complaining about the fact, well, what are these racialized groups? Why don't they just, I had disadvantages. I was poor. My parents weren't the elites. I wasn't on the inside in that way. And I said, yes, but you've never been discriminated against. You've never had that. And that is something. So I think I don't have a clear-cut, definitive answer about how you get people to do that. But again, I come back to it's one-on-one relationships, the people who are around you and talking and changing, and both racialized people who you know and see, and friends, associates.
Nancy, do you want to?
Sure. For me, because I've been immersed now for about the last 7 years at Dalhousie in academia, I have been finding that students are basically, especially in the School of Social Work, of course, some have said on fire for social justice. And I think if you position this within a social justice lens, the social equity lens, I think it shows a pathway forward for them to get behind it and to think about the ways that racism is socially constructed and how can we deconstruct it. And I think that a lot of work has been done in that regard now in terms of looking at colonization and what is the process of decolonization. So I feel that framing it as a social justice issue is really, really important. And one of the questions that Wanda had asked earlier was looking at how do maybe we could share some examples of our own experiences of being an ally. And I just wanted to share one where I had been conducting some research related to experiences of gender-based violence and the pro-arrest, pro-charge, pro-prosecution policies. And I found that there was no research, almost like one article or zero, related to the experiences of African Nova Scotians. So when you think about that, I think it shows it's a gap, of course, but it's a racist gap, and it shows a disregard for their experiences. So I think that is a justice issue. So looking at steps that we can take in our own worlds in terms of recognizing allyship as a commitment to social justice, I think is really helpful. And Layla Said, who wrote the book Me and White Supremacy, she talks about looking at allyship as a commitment to doing the right thing. She suggests that you do it out of love and don't expect a reward, but do it out of a sense of integrity.
Yeah, if I just pick up on that, I think that that's such an important thing. Preaching to the choir is preaching to the choir, and it behooves us to reach beyond our comfort zone and beyond the people we're comfortable with. There's a quote that I really like from Emily Dickinson that I think can sustain us through this. It's something like, truth is so rare a thing, it's delightful to tell it. That's the quote. But the reality is, we know is that sometimes when we tell it, the response is not very pleasant. But I think that it's important to do that, and it's I see this as a one person at a time thing. But it's not a blunderbuss. It's not saying, oh, you're not socially aware. It is listening, taking the time to figure out where they're coming from, asking them questions, asking them to think critically about these things, because otherwise we just end up with two solitudes banging heads with each other, and we're not going to get to where we need to get.
If I can just add one thing, I've worried for the longest time that if I just all of a sudden start asking questions of somebody I meet in the gym or a person who's working in the store that I'm at, that can be one, threatening, and why are you talking to me? And and then I would very easily ask people, where are you from? Over the years of being in politics, knocking on thousands of doors, but all of a sudden that takes on a different impact and implication if I ask somebody of color where they're from. I mean, and immediately you could see where I'm threatening. So I've really struggled with that. And again, I think the key here is the difference between performance and authenticity. If I'm doing this about me, clearly the human condition just understands that immediately, the other person. But if I'm really making an effort to say, this isn't about my experience, this is about your experience, I can't imagine it. I'm not going to have the hubris to suggest that I even could begin to, but I can have empathy as a human being who has feelings and can imagine what it must be like for you to look at your kids and realize that they may not have the same kinds of opportunities. They won't, as my kids do. And I try to focus on that.
I think one of the things that's really important is to encourage allies to do the work. So doing their own work is really, really important. So you're not learning off the backs of the people you're supposedly trying to help. And I think that one of the other things one of the questions I always like to ask, well, who are you when no one's looking or listening?
Yeah.
So, what decisions are you making in the moment
Mm-hmm.
when you're not performing for someone else? And the other thing is people really have to act from where they are.
Hmm.
And so, yes, it's about individuals, about relationship building, but it's also needs to be about action. And what actions can you take from where you are? So it may be individual actions that you take, just in terms of treating people with respect, treating people the way you want to be treated, that sort of thing. But it can also be about using your voice, using your position.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like one of the quotes I'd like to use from the new Vice President of the United States. She used a quote from her mother. My mother said, "Kamala, you will be the first in many things, but make sure you're not the last." And so part of that is reaching back and lifting as you lead, but allies can do that sort of thing as well, sort of creating change where they are, making a difference where they are. And I don't know if either of you have any experiences around allyship that you might want to share that shifts the institutions or shifts the systems a little bit.
Well, I can speak to a project that I'm now doing with Senator Wanda Thomas Bernard that's looking at culturally responsive healthcare practices in response to gender-based violence. So when Wanda suggested that she was open to partnering on this, I kind of jumped at the opportunity. And what we're hoping to do with this research is to develop principles that can guide healthcare. And we're hoping so we're involving a lot of students, which has been a real pleasure. And we've been working with the Association of Black Social Workers in Nova Scotia. And we're looking at developing some films. So we're looking at a lot of different things, but we're hoping that this will influence system change. And we'll look at, acknowledge that a lot of people of color do not feel comfortable accessing, for example, calling the police, accessing healthcare, accessing a lot of services. And why is that? And sort of looking at addressing those barriers and then looking at how do we make these systems more responsive to their needs and more inclusive in a way that people feel safe to access them. So that's an example, I think, of looking at how we can influence system change, hopefully.
I've had, well, the most significant thing I've done as an ally, I think, is at the institutional level. Although I should be careful about saying that's the most significant. It was certainly one of the most powerful experiences I've had in years in public life, and that was working with you, Senator Thomas Bernard, on your inquiry, and then ending up working with the group that was coordinating activity, and so I think I feel that was productive, and although I got way more out of it probably than I gave, but I'm very glad I had that chance. But now I make an effort to acknowledge racialized people who I meet wherever in a way that isn't contrived or inauthentic. Even just nodding to them on the street as they walk by. I know it sounds like a small thing, but as I understand this idea of feeling like you're not part of it, you're always on the outside, that something could happen, that there are things that I wouldn't even remotely consider to be threatening a racialized person may. And so I don't play a lot of golf, but at the golf course I play, there's a young fellow working for the summer called Leon. And I made a point of talking to him each time I went. Trying to avoid being condescending and patronizing. And the young woman that I mentioned, who's a social work student in Kelowna, and I went out of my way, and I will talk again with her. So that's kind of where it is for me at this point. And I think there's one person at a time.
Sounds like the life of a retired senator.
I think he got this that he was golfing in the summertime right now in just he snuck that in. Looking out the window, it's freezing rain here. But I think that what one of the things it's so important is that when I think about allyship, I also I think the vector runs in multiple dimensions, and uh, when I speak to my friends who are white, if they say something which is racially disparaging, and if I don't step in
Mhm.
and use that as a teachable moment or as an inquiry moment, then I'm not an ally. You see, I mean, I really have to take it upon myself to do that,
Mhm.
because I think that otherwise silence means consent, and I can't be
Exactly.
silent. So
Yeah.
we have to constantly
Mhm.
do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's really about creating those braver spaces,
Mhm.
having the courageous conversations,
Mhm.
even when it feels difficult, because
Mhm.
the alternative is causing a lot of harm.
Mhm.
And
Mm.
that I think that's one of the things that's been really clearly stated today, and that
Mhm.
we've a theme that we've heard throughout the past 7 weeks, that racism does cause harm,
Mhm.
Right.
does cause trauma, no matter what type of racism it is. And so the role of allies in helping to mitigate, to change is very, very important to the work.
Mhm.
And there's a flip side to that. I know we're running out of time, but and the flip side is that equality is not a zero-sum game.
Mm.
I don't lose what I've got because somebody who hasn't had that privilege gets it. I don't lose that. We all benefit from that. And if everybody is better educated and more healthy and is allowed to live in places that we should all be allowed to live in and get good jobs, then the whole society is better for that. We're all better for that.
And
Absolutely.
I think you're so right, but sadly, there are people who would tear us asunder by arguing the opposite.
Yeah,
So
Hmm.
we have to
because
speak and speak loudly. Yeah.
they're afraid of losing what they've got. And my theory on racists and bullies is that they're all weak people and they
And part of
expose
that,
themselves.
yeah, the part of that fear of losing what you have comes from being very entrenched in a capitalist society,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
Is
Mhm.
that notion of, survival of the fittest, what do I get from me?
Mhm.
And as opposed to a more Afrocentric, more
Mhm.
indigenous way
Mhm.
of being,
Mhm.
focusing more on cooperation. How can we work together? What can we bring to each other?
Mhm.
I really wish we had more time to continue the conversations. And you know what? I'm going to take this opportunity to publicly say thank you to all three of you for being an ally that I know I can count on. So, Senator Kucher, I want to thank you for bringing this idea to me, because this whole series was your idea. Yes, we've developed it as a team, but the original idea, the seed, came from you, and I want to thank you for that.
Pleasure.
Dr. Nancy Ross, we've worked together in the field, at the school, and now you've let out my secret that I'm actively doing a research project with you. So thank you for your allyship over the years. And Senator Mitchell, I remember when I asked you if you would speak to that inquiry, and your initial reaction was, I'm a white male, what can I bring to this? That started a dialogue, and it started a conversation, and it sparked a commitment and a friendship that has lasted beyond your retirement.
Mhm.
So I want to thank you for your allyship
My pleasure.
and your friendship. This is our last of this series, but it's not the last that you will hear from us. The group that I belong to in the Senate, the Progressive Senators Group, has funded me to do a survey on the series. So this survey is going to be launched tomorrow. It's the Pandemic of Racism Discussion Series survey. We've contracted Horizons in Nova Scotia to conduct this survey for us, so it's an independent survey. The hope is that this short survey will guide our next steps and address the important issues that have been raised during each of these 7 weeks. So for anyone who's participated, either as a guest or watching or participating, watching live or watching the series after the fact, we want to really encourage you to take the survey so that you can give us your input. We know that we've started something. We think it's something significant. We know that it cannot end here, but we really want to be guided by those who've been participating. We want to be guided by you to help us plan the next steps. So with that, we'll say thank you very much. Thank you both for being with us today.
Yeah, it's awesome.
It's
Thank
been
you.
a
It's my
phenomenal,
pleasure.
Very appreciated.
phenomenal conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank
Bye-bye.
you, Wanda, for your leadership
Yeah,
in all of
thanks.
this.